Welcome to the 6th episode of the 8-part podcast Scandal and Controversy in Russian Literature, a tantalizing series about awkward novels, daring statements and dangerous quotes. Today, 4 little brats in Tallinn. Your host is Otto Boele, senior lecturer at Leiden University, specialized in Russian literature and film history. Otto, in the previous episodes you focused on one book, but this time you want to cover more books and more writers. Why is that?
Well, there's still one book that takes center stage, A Ticket to the Stars by Vasily Aksyonov. But this book is the pinnacle of a movement that emerged in the Soviet Union after Stalin's death in 1953. To do justice to the story about Aksyonov, I also need to discuss a couple of texts that preceded A Ticket to the Stars. And I can assure you, listeners with a little patience will be rewarded.
Высший суд мой коммунистический, живет товарищ политехнический.
In the early 1960s, the Soviet Union witnessed a new phenomenon. Young writers and poets drew large crowds to their readings, enjoying the same status as pop stars in the West. What's more, they were personalities without any fear of the camera, and they dressed extravagantly, at least by Soviet standards. This is the thaw, a time in which the Soviet Union tried to come to terms with the horrors of Stalinism and seemed to open up to the rest of the world. It's a time that is characterized by more liberal cultural policies, a time that offered new heroes and new role models for the Soviet youth. The angry young men of Soviet literature were allowed to enjoy their freedom for a while. But then, at the end of the 1960s, the party was over, and they had to go back in line. Those who refused to accept the new reality were mostly cut off from official Soviet literature. They had no option but to distribute their work illegally and eventually to emigrate to the West. This is what happened to Vasily Aksyonov, and the novel that started it was A Ticket to the Stars from 1961. The novel was published in a literary magazine and enjoyed great success, especially with young people, but it never came to an official book edition. In hindsight, the authorities considered the tone too rebellious, and they suggested a number of adjustments. That wasn't too much to ask, was it? It was for Aksyonov, and he refused to implement the proposed improvements. This is the story of a sparkling, defiant youth novel, and the relentless efforts of Soviet officials to bring it in line with Soviet ideology.
Москва, 28 июля. Более 2 миллионов москвичей вышли в этот день приветствовать участников Международного фестиваля молодежи и студентов.
In 1957, the International Youth Festival took place in Moscow. It was something unheard of. Thousands of young people from all over the world, including from capitalist countries, came to Moscow to do what exactly? To celebrate peace? To get to know each other, as far as the language barrier allowed? Was it a propaganda stunt by the Soviets? Sure, but instead of red Soviet flags, there were now all kinds of national flags on display. And for Muscovites, it was an important event. Foreigners in the city, and you can even talk to them. Imagine that. The Youth Festival was one of the highlights of the thaw, an international showpiece that illustrated how, after Stalin's death in 1953, the Soviet Union wanted to come clean with the atrocities committed under his leadership, and now sought to propagate communism with a human face. 1957, the year of the Youth Festival, saw even more Soviet success stories. Sputnik, the first satellite, was successfully launched, and film director Mikhail Kalatozov won a Golden Palm with his war drama The Cranes Are Flying. In short, the Soviet Union was in the picture, and how. What preceded the Youth Festival is generally known. In 1953, Stalin died, and in 1956, more than a year before the Youth Festival, Nikita Khrushchev, the new leader, gave his famous speech on the personality cult and its consequences. It depicts Stalin as vain, suspicious, ignorant, and with an incredible lust for power.
The cult took on such monstrous proportions mainly because Stalin himself encouraged and supported the glorification of his person in every possible way. Stalin shielded himself from the people. He never went out, and it went on for decades. His last visit to the countryside was in 1928. 1928, comrades! How was he supposed to know what things were really like? He judged the country in general, and agriculture in particular, exclusively on the basis of movies that portrayed the situation much better than it really was.
With this speech, the conditions for society's de-Stalinization were created. That process was given an extra boost when in 1961 it was decided to remove Stalin's embalmed body from Lenin's mausoleum. Lying next to the founding father of the Soviet Union was considered too much honor for a man who was responsible for the death of so many innocent people, including loyal communists. But the thaw was, above all, an uncertain period. Nobody knew what was coming, and the policies of the new leaders were anything but consistent. The introduction of more freedom could lead to undesirable side effects, and this would then require an immediate repressive response. Take the uprising in Hungary in 1956 that was bloodily crushed, or the fierce discussion in the Soviet Union as a result of Khrushchev's speech. The Communist Party was in danger of losing control, and they couldn't allow that to happen. This is why historians characterize the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev as a period of greater freedom and relaxation, but also with its freezes. Short ice ages, so to speak, in which the regime showed its teeth, also internationally. After all, in 1962, the United States and the Soviet Union were on the brink of a nuclear war due to the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's easy to trace these mood swings by looking at Soviet literature. It all began in December 1953, more than half a year after Stalin's death, with a lengthy essay by Vladimir Pomerantsev on sincerity in literature. It was published in the New World, the most authoritative literary magazine in the Russian-speaking world to this day. Pomerantsev's position is clear. 99% of contemporary Soviet literature offers nothing but clichés. The characters, the stories, the hyped-up optimism, everything is completely tried and predictable. What is lacking is truthfulness, authenticity, sincerity on the part of the writer. Pomerantsev's essay is interesting for two reasons. It introduces into the public debate a term that will more or less become the magic word of the thaw, iskrenность, which, depending on what it refers to, can be translated as sincerity or truthfulness. This is what was lacking in literature and in the arts in general under Stalin. Literature under Stalin was characterized by lakirovka, the layer of varnish that was applied so that the depicted reality seemed more beautiful than it really was. This is what made Stalinist art implausible and inauthentic. So get rid of the lakirovka, says Pomerantsev. Write authentic, truthful literature. The iskrenность must return. The second reason why Pomerantsev's essay is so important is its reception. Pomerantsev received a lot of acclaim, and as I said, with that term iskrenность, he more or less introduced the key concept of the thaw. But Stalinist hardliners didn't let go of him so easily. Let's not forget that Stalin was only just dead, and Khrushchev hadn't yet delivered his famous speech. So Pomerantsev was certainly not collectively hoisted on the shield. On the contrary, a counter-offensive was launched, and Pomerantsev was fiercely attacked by conservative critics who spoke out against him in Pravda, the party newspaper. At a certain point, even Khrushchev got involved. In retrospect, you may wonder why people were getting so worked up about this. Yes, Pomerantsev was in favor of sincerity in literature, but were his enemies against sincerity? Pomerantsev rejected the so-called lakirovka, the layer of varnish, but had anyone ever defended it as such? According to historian Denis Kozlov, author of a standard work about the New World and its readers, Pomerantsev was being imprudent by trashing most Soviet literature. his message was simply too radical. No wonder many people took offense and regarded him as a traitor. An additional problem was that the whole polemic was fought out in the open, and not only by literary professionals. Readers had begun to get involved as well by writing letters to the editor of the New World. In short, an unsavory situation had emerged, and this required a sharp response from the authorities. No one was arrested or sent to a prison camp, but the editor-in-chief of the New World was relieved of his post. Pomerantsev was reprimanded and increasingly marginalized. He almost didn't get a chance to publish anything else. Here is another example of the speed with which thaws and short ice ages could alternate. In 1956, a certain Vladimir Dudintsev publishes his novel Not by Bread Alone. It hits the literary establishment like a bomb, and not only in the Soviet Union, the book was immediately translated into various languages. The main character is a certain Lapatkin, an engineer somewhere in the provinces who has developed a new and revolutionary technique for casting steel pipes. The method is cheaper, and the quality of the pipes is much higher than what is currently the standard. Apart from being a brilliant engineer, Lapatkin is also an ideal communist.
I was never able to believe in petty bourgeois communism. Anyone who thinks that under communism everyone can walk around in gold-embroidered clothes is mistaken. The petty bourgeois attached to the material expects only one thing from communism: how can we fill our bellies?
But then the story takes an unexpected turn. Lapatkin seeks contact with real specialists and industrial bosses in Moscow to further develop his method. Unfortunately, the establishment is not eager to support this talented provincial. Lapatkin encounters envy, careerism, abuse of power. Hardly anyone seems to have the public interest in mind. Everyone tries to keep Lapatkin out or even steal his invention. Fortunately, and inevitably in a Soviet novel, there are also well-meaning people in high positions, and they make sure that things work out more or less well. In the end, justice prevails, and Lapatkin comes out on top as the moral winner. But the picture that Dudintsev paints of Soviet science is of course shocking. Although the story is deliberately set in the very recent past, that is, before Stalin's death, it would be naive to think that all of a sudden research institutes are only staffed with dedicated scientists. Clearly there was something rotten about the field of applied sciences in the Soviet Union. Dudintsev had been so brave to show this openly.
Когда весна придет, не знаю, пройдут дожди, сойдут снега, но ты мне улица родная и в непогоду дорога.
Not by Bread Alone was the literary sensation of 1956. The New World received hundreds of letters from readers who complimented Dudintsev on his courage to confront these abuses in Soviet science. Readers indicated that they recognized what Dudintsev was writing about, and they often claimed that exactly the same thing had happened at their work. Such letters, sometimes 30 pages long, were accompanied by a detailed reconstruction of the injustice done, including the names of the people responsible for it. But the most typical thing was that readers expressed their indignation in the extremely aggressive language of Stalinist propaganda. They called for the opportunists and the bureaucrats to be exposed and publicly condemned.
Yes, it is certainly true that we already knew the words job hunter, bureaucrat, and opportunist before this novel was written, but Dudintsev has shown us the nasty slime that has been hiding behind honest Soviet citizens for decades.
As Denis Kozlov has shown, Soviet citizens who identified with Khrushchev's new course and welcomed the return to the pure principles of Marxism-Leninism were not necessarily very tolerant, open-minded, or liberal, nor was Khrushchev himself. And this we should keep in mind when we talk about the more liberal climate of the thaw when compared to the repressions under Stalin. The discussion about not by bread alone also shows how short such a more open period could last. The Hungarian uprising broke out at the end of 1956. This was an unintended side effect of Khrushchev's de-Stalinization course. And in 1957, the literary world was shocked by the scandal surrounding Boris Pasternak's novel Dr. Zhivago, a revisionist book about the Russian Civil War which the author had published in Italy, a mortal sin for a Soviet writer. Suddenly the regime showed its teeth again. Pasternak was reviled in the press, and concerned citizens who hadn't read the novel publicly expressed their disapproval. When Pasternak was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1958, at home the pressure mounted to the extent that he had to refuse it. That's how quickly the mood could suddenly change again. And Vladimir Dudintsev? He couldn't publish much until the next thaw, the period of glasnost and perestroika under Mikhail Gorbachev. Even so, Not by Bread Alone is a monument of the early thaw, in which the aggressive rhetoric and vocabulary of Stalinism still dominated, paradoxically enough, also among those who wanted to leave Stalinism behind.
Утро начинается с рассвета. Здравствуй, здравствуй, необъятная страна. Пустует там есть своя планета. Это целина.
A literary genre that boomed in the late 1950s is that of the youth novel or youth drama. Literature intended for and about young adults also existed before the thaw, but that was mainly about Komsomol youth during the war or during the reconstruction of the country just after the war. But the new generation, that had no active memory of it, found it difficult to identify with these young war veterans. And it was this younger generation, born around the start of the war, that was being targeted by this new wave of youth literature. And that wasn't surprising, given the regime's ambition to reboot the communist project after the dead end of Stalinism. This new generation, a generation without blood on their hands from the Stalin era, would become absolutely crucial in building the radiant future of communism. What did this youth literature from the thaw period look like? What were its most specific features? And do we see any iskrenost, that sincerity or truthfulness that Vladimir Pomerantsev had advocated? In general, we can say this about it. In Soviet youth literature of this period, the hero is usually male and young, 17, 18 years old, and as a rule he has just passed his final exams. He is restless, rough around the edges, has a cheeky and defiant attitude towards his parents and other grown-ups. At the same time, the reader understands that his heart is in the right place. He is intelligent and well-meaning, but he is still searching and he avoids the beaten track. Take, for example, the play Good Luck by the hugely popular playwright Viktor Rozov. It premiered in 1955 and was sold out for a month throughout the Soviet Union. The play is about Andrei, a 17-year-old high school graduate who has to decide upon his further education. His parents could easily get him into any institute or university, just by pulling some strings. His father is a professor. But the hero refuses any help, also because he doesn't feel like studying anyway, at least not yet. Andrei is fed up with Moscow, with his parents, and at the end of the play he moves to Siberia to work on some big construction project. There he will test himself, and eventually, when he is older, wiser, calmer, he will return to his hometown and continue his education. At least, this is what the play suggests. Andrei's maturation isn't shown. It's something that we, viewers, have to take for granted. It's hardly surprising that conservative critics were unhappy with this new, wayward type of literary character. In their opinion, it fell short of the Stalinist ideal that required full commitment to the party line and an unwavering attitude in any situation. Another successful author of youth novels, Anatoly Kuznetsov, defended his work by introducing the term complex optimism.
The Soviet youth is an optimist, but what he needs is not the primitive optimism we often dish out in official directives or moralistic narratives. He needs complex optimism.
Complex optimism was more or less in line with socialist-realism, to show reality in its historical revolutionary context, which means that you show reality as developing progressively towards the ultimate goal of communism. But Kuznetsov's concept of complex optimism also links up with Pomerantsev's call for more sincerity. The straightforward, primitive optimism of the Stalin period was felt to be outdated and therefore insincere. But that was precisely the problem. Too much complexity would destroy optimism and diminish the hero's exemplary function. The hero would lose its heroic traits and turn into a doubting figure, a Hamlet. And this is indeed the criticism that was leveled at Kuznetsov and at Aksyonov. Could their hero still be said to be representative of Soviet youth? And if they did, what part of Soviet youth did they represent? Wasn't Soviet literature best served if writers simply ignored such characters who so obviously fell short of the Soviet moral standard? This discussion reached its climax in 1961 when Vasily Aksyonov published his novel, A Ticket to the Stars.
Утро начинается с рассвета. Здравствуй, здравствуй, необъятная страна.
This is Scandal and Controversy in Russian Literature. Your host is Otto Bulik.
Vasily Pavlovich Aksyonov is not completely unknown in the West. His most important novels, especially those written in exile, were translated into English and numerous other Western languages. He was one of the more prominent members of the Russian writer community outside the USSR. For years he lived and worked in the United States, including as a lecturer in Russian literature at George Mason University in Virginia. And during that time he made no secret of his aversion to the Soviet regime. Aksyonov's problematic relationship with the Soviet authorities goes back to his earliest childhood. His parents were devoted communists, but that offered no guarantees during Stalin's Great Terror. And in 1937, at the height of the terror, both his parents were arrested. Aksyonov was only 5 years old. His mother was sentenced to 10 years in prison and 5 years of exile for allegedly being a member of a Trotskyist plot. His father even faced the death penalty for insufficient Bolshevik vigilance. He held an important position in the city of Kazan. After spending months on death row, he saw his sentence commuted to 15 years in camp. Aksyonov spent a year in an orphanage. Then he grew up with relatives. In 1947, at 16, he received a letter from his mother. Her prison sentence had ended, but she was not yet allowed to leave the region, and so she continued to live in the city of Magadan. She made Aksyonov come over, and he spent the last years of his secondary education there. His mother instilled in him a love of literature, and introduced him to the work of pre-revolutionary poets who were emphatically banned from the Soviet school curriculum at the time. After graduating from high school, Aksyonov decided to study medicine, first in Kazan, then in Leningrad. But he seemed more interested in jazz, fashion, and girls than in his studies. Aksyonov's father, who had just returned from the camp, wasn't happy with his son's academic performance, and he told him so in a letter.
Unfortunately, you have become infected with some rotten lifestyle that will lead directly to disappointment and mental numbness. I am aware that you do not take the tram, but prefer to be driven around in taxis, to buy expensive theatre tickets for your girlfriends, only to go hungry for a few days a month afterwards. What kind of madness is this? Shame on you!
The relationship with his father would eventually improve, but we also sense the beginning of a generational conflict. The work ethic of his father and the somewhat rebellious attitude of the 23-year-old Aksyonov would become the most important themes of his novel A Ticket to the Stars. Aksyonov may not have been a terribly dedicated student, but he did finish his studies, and he even started working as a doctor. His ultimate dream was to sign on as a ship's doctor and see something of the world. But that was impossible given the contaminated past of his parents. Aksyonov worked for some time in Karelia, again in Leningrad, and then settled in Moscow. In 1960, he published his first longer novella, Colleagues, about his experiences as a country doctor. And then, in 1961, the novel A Ticket to the Stars. Both works were published in the journal Youth, founded in 1955, especially to give younger writers and poets their own platform. This is yet another sign that the regime is trying to make a new start, in which the younger generation, untainted by Stalinism, must play an important role. A Ticket to the Stars tells the story of three Moscow friends who have just graduated. Dima, the central hero, Alik, an aspiring writer and a snob who considers classical Russian literature below his dignity, and Yura, the sporty type. In the first chapter, we find them talking in the courtyard of their dilapidated residential complex, Barcelona, an absurdly exotic name that is in stark contrast to the fact that the characters have hardly been outside Moscow. This is also the topic of their conversation. They have passed their graduation exams, and now they deserve a vacation. They will secretly travel to Tallinn and do some serious partying. A fourth character joins them, Galia, more or less Dima's girlfriend. She's determined to come along. With what they can scrape together, they take the train to Tallinn, at that time the most western city in the Soviet Union, not only geographically but also culturally. The local population could listen to Finnish radio, and the medieval city center looks more German than Russian. The four friends have a great time on the beaches of Tallinn, but at a certain point they find themselves penniless. To earn some money they sign on a fishing boat, their first encounter with real hard work. At this point, the reader expects the work experience will have the desired effect. The hero is struggling, but he will prevail and become a mature member of the collective. But in Aksyonov's novel, this narrative template is partly undermined. Alik, the intellectual, comes to understand that if he really wants to become a writer, he needs to read up on classical literature. He's finally going to read Anna Karenina. The same can be said about Galia and Yura, who also seem to have matured and are now ready for the next conscious step in their lives. But Dima, the central hero, is still at a loss. What does he want from life? Go study? Find another job? Yes, he does have a little more experience, but now what? This is what Dima says to himself at the end of the novel.
I was just a sad case, a case of retarded development. I still had no clear path in mind. There were several things I'd like to do. Tear down old walls with a crowbar, join rescue expeditions, cook, go on a pub crawl, kiss Galia, but none of that was a life program. These were all just simple one-time jobs. Dmitry Denisov leaves everything to chance. Ha! What a wonderful topic for a discussion with the Komsomol.
A Ticket to the Stars is a slightly more complicated novel than this summary suggests. It's not only about Dima and his friends, but also about Dima's brother, Viktor, who is 10 years his senior. Viktor is 28 to be precise, the same age Aksyonov was when he wrote the novel. Viktor is a serious and responsible young man, working on his dissertation, he's a physicist, and about to get engaged. All in all, he's much more comme il faut than that little brat Dima, but then he belongs to a different generation. A generation that is more disciplined, more anxious to do everything by the book, in comparison with the new generation of Dima. Viktor tries to talk some sense into his baby brother. Don't go to Tallinn, but prepare for the entrance exams. But Dima hardly listens. and makes it clear how much he despises his older brother's lifestyle.
You don't think I feel the slightest urge to follow in your footsteps, do you? Or that your life would be my ideal? That life, Victor, our old folks invented for you. They planned it all for you when you were still in the cradle. So you got high grades in school, you got high grades in college, and you jumped through all the hoops on your way to the Academy of Sciences. That is, you became a corpse widely respected by the community. But I tell you that you have never decided anything for yourself in your life. You have never dared to take any risk. I'd rather be a bum and a failure than a good little boy who spends his life enforcing other people's decisions.
Victor's function in the story is not simply to act as the opposite of his younger brother. He's also the narrator in the chapters that are set in Moscow. Alternately, we deal with an omniscient narrator and two first-person narrators, the two brothers Dima and Victor. This is quite a complex structure for a Soviet novel of that time. In this way, the reader also shares Victor's impressions and observations, his admiration and even jealousy of that younger generation that dares to be rash and speak its mind. Ultimately, Victor will take Dima's criticism to heart and adopt an independent, even defiant attitude, namely when he has to defend his dissertation. His superior encourages him to play it safe. Stick to the previous findings of your research and complete your PhD as quickly as possible. In terms of professional advancement, that is the smartest thing to do. But Victor decides to ignore this advice and instead present his latest insights, which are far too innovative for the academic establishment. By doing so, Victor has probably ruined his own career. This is undoubtedly one of the most daring aspects of A Ticket to the Stars. In socialist-realist literature, under Stalin as well as under Khrushchev, in addition to the somewhat restless hero, there is always a mentor figure, an older character who coaches the young hero, keeps him on the right path, and guides him with a gentle hand towards his political maturity. But in Aksyonov we find the opposite situation. Indirectly, Dima, with his youthful rashness, acts as his older brother's mentor. And there are more things opposite to how they should go in the youth novel. Normally, the restless young hero postpones his university studies and finds some kind of job among ordinary workers. He certainly does not go on a holiday. But this is exactly what Dima and his friends do, and they think they're entitled to it. After all, they've toiled at school for 10 long years. In the youth novel, the hero usually moves to the east. The development of Siberia and the massive construction projects there were key components of Khrushchev's policies and propaganda. But what do Dima and his friends do? They go to the most Western and most European point of the Soviet Union, where they enjoyed Western music, jazz in the first place. In short, A Ticket to the Stars is not so much a youth novel as an anti-youth novel. The hero goes to the west, not to the east. He doesn't want to work, but enjoys himself. He does not follow the example of the potential mentor figure. The roles are reversed. Dima becomes an inspiration for his older brother. And most importantly, Dima doesn't seem to be growing up. At the end of the story, he is just as unwilling to toe the line as before. It was this particular detail that many critics regarded as Aksyonov's biggest mistake. Dima's lack of maturity was the main reason why Ticket to the Stars was never published as a separate book edition. But this was a discussion that took place mainly among literary professionals, editors, critics, and other writers supplying Aksyonov with well-meant advice. In the perception of the general public, other aspects of the novel caught the eye. First, the language of Dima and his friends. Second, the alleged disrespect for the older generation, especially the parents. As for the language, it's not easy to give an impression because it gets lost in translation, and the slang spoken by the young Muscovites is of course long since outdated. It's not extremely rude or obscene. Of course, such language was completely taboo in the Soviet Union, but it does contain some English words, as well as condescending expressions to refer to the older generation. For example, the four friends invariably refer to their parents with the term ancestors to indicate the distance that separates the two generations. But worse than the way in which the characters expressed themselves was the fact that teenagers and young adults turned out to have their own jargon. This came as a shock to older readers and especially conservative critics. For younger readers, this was often the ultimate proof that Aksyonov had written a truthful novel to which they could relate. In the autumn of 1961, a so-called Readers' Conference with Aksyonov took place. A Readers' Conference was the Soviet version of what we would now call a meet and greet the author, but it had more the character of a discussion in which readers and the writer in question participated, but also one or more editors and critics, and a few authoritative figures from the Komsomol, the communist youth organization. At this particular conference in 1961, several young readers expressed their admiration for Aksyonov, who had succeeded in reproducing the specific language of young Muscovites. Here are two reader reactions recorded by a stenographer, as was customary at the time.
I like the spoken language in the novel. That's true to life. But of course you don't talk to your parents that way, and we don't talk like that amongst ourselves.
As we have seen today, the majority of my peers are in favor of this novel. It is especially strong because it shows the prose of life without all the hyped-up ideas that you so often come across in other novels. A Ticket to the Stars is real and truthful, and it is written in a language that you will encounter on every street corner in our country.
Another contentious point is the way in which the parents are portrayed. It's indeed somewhat caricatured. As soon as the four teenagers turn out to have flown, Yura's father grumbles that our children haven't been spanked enough. Dima's mother reacts completely hysterically. The parents do not appear further in the story, which contributes to the impression that they play only a marginal role in their children's lives. With this character constellation, Aksyonov suggested that there was a real generational gap in the Soviet Union, and that too was a terrible mistake. But why exactly? What is so disturbing about the idea that young adults live in a world of their own? It may be hard to imagine, but the Soviet Union, especially after Stalin's death, also developed the traits of a modern consumer society. This is also what Nikita Khrushchev had promised. He would raise the living standards of ordinary citizens, a promise that was reflected, among other things, in a major building campaign that brought the prospect of owning a home more or less within reach. Most Soviet citizens still lived in communal housing, or even in barracks. A byproduct of that development was the emergence of, yes, a kind of youth culture. A youth culture that was not politically or ideologically motivated, but was very Western-oriented. I should immediately add that reliable information about the West was hardly available, and people fantasized a lot about it. The anthropologist Alexei Yurchak has introduced the term imaginary West, meaning the West as it existed in the minds of many young people. That was an extremely rosy picture of a world without any material shortages, full of hip and extravagant clothes, the latest dance styles, cool jazz and rock and roll. How much this image was romanticized and idealized became clear when the Russians were able to visit the West after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The somewhat condescending term used for this kind of fashion-conscious youth was stiliaga, meaning a youngster who was completely obsessed with the outward imitation of Western fashion. Some young people accepted that term as a kind of nickname, others rejected it, but that there was a subculture among the urban youth that preferred Western popular culture to the official culture of the Soviet Union was at some point clear to everyone. It wasn't really illegal to listen to Western music, which was often distributed via old X-rays on which a real record had been copied, but it wasn't recommended either. The Komsomol tried to discipline these young people, both with probing conversations and public humiliations. Again, these kinds of expressions of youth culture were rarely, if ever, politically motivated. They were not against the Soviet Union, but the authorities were afraid that outward imitation of Western examples would also cause the rotten ideology of the West to penetrate the pores of Soviet society. Aksyonov himself had enjoyed the reputation of a stiliaga in his student days. He was indeed fond of jazz and was an enthusiastic member of the Leningrad youth scene. With his novel he fueled this fear of moral degradation, and some critics even interpreted A Ticket to the Stars as an attempt to persuade young people to listen only to Western music, to flee the parental home, to be insolent toward the older generation, etc., etc. To the Soviet regime it was important, both toward its own citizens and towards the outside world, to maintain the image of a united and optimistic community made up of different age cohorts but not divided by generational discord. In A Ticket to the Stars, Aksyonov seemed to suggest the opposite. As early as in the opening scene, we see two generations collide. The courtyard of the residential complex suddenly fills with loud rock and roll music, to the delight of Dima and his friends, after which the older generation tries to spoil the fun by demanding to stop that terrible racket.
Прекратите это безобразие! Прекратите сию минуту! Я с вами совершенно согласна, Зинаида Петровна. 2 часа не могу решить кроссворда. Весь двор отравлен.
The main character, Dima Denisov, rebels not only against his parents, but even against his 10-year older brother. What had Aksyonov actually wanted to say with this fictional portrait of a Moscow teenager? Why had he made Dima the main character? In Soviet literature, the central hero was supposed to embody particular social tendencies. Society evolves progressively, and somehow we see that evolution reflected in the problems the hero faces and ideally overcomes. This idea goes back to 19th century literary criticism, which was always on the lookout for heroes of our time, typical representatives of their generation who, despite the fact that they are fictional characters, can help the reader understand what is really going on in society. But if this is how a literary character is viewed, as a portrait of an entire generation, then a pressing question arises in the case of A Ticket to the Stars. Is Dima also a hero of our time? Does Aksyonov present him as a role model? Does he call on young people to flee their parental home and relax on the beaches of Tallinn? Aksyonov had to defend himself against this kind of criticism at the readers' conference mentioned earlier. Now, of course, the novel should not be taken so literally. A Ticket to the Stars was not an attempt to idealize or rehabilitate the Staliagi. That some readers and critics still thought this way was the sad legacy of the Stalin years, when literature was full of cardboard heroes spouting platitudes about serving the great leader. What Aksyonov had wanted to show was the mutual influence of two generations, Viktor's and Dima's. But here Aksyonov had to maneuver very carefully. He could not completely let go of the didactic aspect of literature, knowing how much it was valued by his critics.
I think we are dealing here with the powerful legacy of dogmatism when the hero of any novel is taken either as a model for imitation or as an object of criticism. Of course, the educational significance of literature is beyond dispute, but literature is also a reflection of real life.
But this too was a dangerous claim. Was Aksyonov saying that his novel gave a truthful and balanced picture of Soviet youth? Sergei Pavlov, chairman of the Komsomol in Tula, a city at about 200 kilometers from Moscow, reacted furiously to this suggestion. The youngsters in A Ticket to the Stars were cardboard windbags, invented characters whom the author had cunningly tried to present as typical representatives of Soviet youth. But Soviet youth wasn't like that at all. If these characters were drawn from life, then it certainly concerned a very small and therefore completely unrepresentative group of young people. Should one bother to write about them at all? What made matters worse for Aksyonov was the fact that he himself enjoyed the reputation of a stiliaga and a troublemaker. And you don't always get the idea that he really tried to convince the authorities of the opposite. This is how the local newspaper of Tula reported on Aksyonov and a few other writers visiting the city in December 1961.
And there you had the writers. Their outward appearance clearly betrayed their taste. And not just their taste. They were dressed like their characters, with long sweaters that came down to their knees. They looked disinterested and behaved in an extremely casual manner.
Pavlov, the Komsomol chairman of Tula, had the matter investigated and obtained another report from an eyewitness.
Aksyonov steps out of the train in an orange sweater with a crocheted scarf around his neck. One of his colleagues has his shirt unbuttoned all the way, and he is carrying a shopping net containing 2 bottles of liquor.
These are, of course, very tendentious descriptions, but we can nevertheless conclude the following from the Tula incident and the Readers' Conference from the autumn of 1961. At least some critics were convinced that Aksyonov had idealized his hero and wanted to present him as a role model. The same critic thought that, in doing so, Aksyonov had made a big mistake. Dima was a bad example and not representative of contemporary Soviet youth in general. We can also detect something provocative in Aksyonov's own behavior. Everything indicates that he was losing his patience with the short-sighted meddling by Soviet officials. These contradictions would only intensify in the years that followed, because officials were also losing their patience with Aksyonov. So, A Ticket to the Stars revolves around a defiant 17 years old who doesn't know what to do with himself. Where have we heard that before? Is this a completely unique character that we only encounter in Soviet literature? Of course not. Think of Jim Stark from the 1955 film Rebel Without a Cause, played by James Dean, and especially Holden Caulfield, the main character and narrator in J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye, arguably one of the most important American novels of the 20th century. The Catcher in the Rye was published in Russian translation in 1960, a few months before Aksyonov's novel came out. No wonder that the two novels were regularly compared. The fact that Catcher in the Rye was published in the Soviet Union may come as a surprise, but starting in the late 1950s, the Soviet Union was making American literature available, partly to meet the demands of the Soviet reader, partly to prove that Soviet writers could compete with their American colleagues and therefore weren't afraid of fair competition. In Russian translation, William Faulkner, and particularly Ernest Hemingway, became extremely popular. J.D. Salinger was no exception. Of course, Holden Caulfield's unpolished language was carefully cleaned up. For fuck, the translator chose a much more innocent word. But otherwise, the editorial board of the magazine Foreign Literature, yet another new literary magazine launched during the thaw, considered it very educational for Soviet youth to learn about the lives of their peers in the United States. The perceived similarities between The Catcher in the Rye and A Ticket to the Stars didn't work in Aksyonov's advantage. It's not that he was suspected of plagiarism, but the behavior of his hero seemed insufficiently motivated. Holden Caulfield's wayward behavior could easily be explained. The poor kid was just unhappy in a suffocating atmosphere of capitalist America. An employee of the publishing house The Soviet Writer, which was supposed to publish the book edition of A Ticket to the Stars, reflected on these differences in her in-house review.
Aksyonov sees his hero as a thoughtful and even intellectual young man, but objectively he isn't that at all. Salinger's hero, also a kid, is driven to despair by his surroundings, and Salinger shows us the events that make the hero so desperate. In the biography of Dima Denisov, not one such event is shown, and yet he is constantly at odds with his environment.
Meanwhile, the cultural and intellectual climate in the Soviet Union began to deteriorate again. At the end of 1962, Khrushchev visited an exhibition of contemporary Soviet painting in the so-called Manège, an important exhibition hall just outside the Kremlin. There were also some abstract paintings, a direction that was completely contrary to the principles of socialist realism. Khrushchev, a loutish man without much education, was furious and attacked the responsible painters on the spot.
Are these supposed to represent human faces? Can't you even properly draw? My grandson is doing a better job. And what is this? Are you men or sissies? How can you paint like that? Aren't you ashamed? And this, what a mess! Did a donkey paint it with its tail or what?
The scandal in the Manège was followed by an unpleasant conversation in March 1963 between the party leadership and a number of young writers, including Andrei Voznesensky and Vasily Aksyonov. Khrushchev was also present and attacked Aksyonov personally. Aware that his parents had been convicted under Stalin, Khrushchev suspected that Aksyonov was now trying to get even with the Soviet state by writing such impossible books as A Ticket to the Stars. Shouldn't Aksyonov take a very good look at himself? Was he aware of his responsibility? Aksyonov had little choice but to make a gesture to reassure the Communist Party and Khrushchev personally. And so a mea culpa appeared in the Pravda of April 3rd, in which he thanked the party leadership for reminding him of his responsibilities. And yet Aksyonov expressed himself in such a vague and non-committal way that he could maintain, as he would later do, that he had never succumbed to the pressure of the authorities.
I can now confidently say that the March meeting in the Sverdlov Hall of the Kremlin was a turning point in the development of our country's art and literature. All of us who were present are now well aware of the tasks that lie ahead in the ideological struggle between communism and capitalism and the struggle against formalistic and decadent tendencies. I think it was especially important for us young writers to recognize this, not only because some of us, myself included, were subjected to fierce criticism at this gathering, but above all to raise our vigilance so that we will write better and better serve the people through our work.
This didn't bode well for the fate of Aksyonov's youth novel. Although it had been made into a film under the title My Younger Brother, many readers were deeply disappointed. The slang of the main characters had disappeared, as had the generational conflict, and the reversal of the mentor-apprentice relationship had been nullified. In the last scene of the film, Dima and his friends return one more time to the already half-demolished Barcelona apartment complex. They look around, wistful and smiling, and then start walking in the direction of a newly built high-rise. Such symbolism was hard to miss. It suggested that Dima had matured after all and was full of resolve to start the next stage of his life. Now, some 60 years later, the film is quite enjoyable, with beautiful shots of Tallinn's medieval city centre and excellent performances by actors Oleg Dal and Alexander Zbruyev, then at the very start of their careers. But anyone who knows the original and the history behind it understands that Aksionov's troublesome novel was skillfully rendered harmless. And the same happened to the novel. No matter how much the publishers of the Soviet writer insisted that Aksyonov rewrite A Ticket to the Stars, Aksyonov never gave in to this pressure. In 1970, the entire manuscript was returned to him. A book edition was no longer an option.
Хорошие вы собаки.
Ну, пошли. Все будет тип-топ. Хорошие вы собаки.
After A Ticket to the Stars, Aksyonov did manage to release a few things in the Soviet Union, but stylistically his work became increasingly experimental, satirical and absurd. As a result, his relationship with the authorities became even more problematic. Like so many writers of his generation, by the late 1960s he had already become a dissident. The crushing of the Prague Spring in 1968 was proof to many that the Soviet Union had returned to a kind of Stalinism light, that is, oppression, but without the arbitrariness of mass terror. Under Leonid Brezhnev, everyone was aware of the rules, and if you played it by the rules, you were okay, however inhumane and absurd those rules were. But this touches on one of the most persistent, contentious aspects of the thaw under Khrushchev and the subsequent period of stagnation under Leonid Brezhnev. The thaw is supposed to have been relatively free and liberal, the second primarily oppressive and suffocating. But there is also a more positive way of saying this. The thaw was a time in which the regime made an ultimate attempt to save the communist project, and this included the idea of a unified middle-brow culture, not elitist but not vulgar and cheap either. That ideal was more or less abandoned in the last 2 decades of the Soviet Union. And precisely because of this waning confidence in the communist project, an alternative underground culture could emerge, offering space for experimentation. This is where we find Aksyonov in the 1970s, until he becomes involved in a new scandal, the clandestine publication of a collective almanac in 1979, after which he is forced to leave the Soviet Union.
Thank you, Otto. I have a question about this episode. What does the book title A Ticket to the Stars mean?
The title refers to the rectangle cutout of the sky that Victor, the older brother, sees when he looks up from his window in the apartment complex Barcelona. In that cutout, he can see the stars, and that reminds him of a ticket in which holes were cut when you took the train. Now that's a metaphor for the central theme of the novel, the destiny in life. And at the end, Dima still doesn't know where his ticket will take him.
Clear. In the next episode you will talk about a novel centered around an embittered police inspector.
Viktor Astafyev's 1986 novel The Sad Detective. Under Gorbachev, writers could openly focus on the downsides of communist society, and some of them did with gusto. That's why this episode is called A Very Dark Novel.
Scandal and Controversy in Russian Literature is a podcast by Otto Boele and Kai Mastenbroek, produced by Electrical Films. Voice actors are Marcusa Hamer and Domenico Gemoli. This series was made with contributions from the Anna Croisset from the Kop Fund and the Leiden University Center for the Arts and Society. The names of the translators and other important references can be found in the description of this podcast. The series is copyrighted by Otto Boele and Electrical Films.